In this second video on the topic of automated visual fields, we'll look at how to interpret a pattern that we see in the visual field. We, in the previous lecture, showed this visual field, and I'd asked what the pattern was, and we're going to leave it as a bit of a cliffhanger. If you think you know the answer, then please write it down or bear it in mind, and we'll come back to it at the end. So first, we just have to remind ourselves what we're looking for in terms of the anatomy and how we think about the patterns. Here we have a picture of the axial section where we have the eyes and the occipital cortex at the back, and an illustration of the visual pathways that are involved here. I'm going to just overview that in a moment. Before we do, in terms of our orientation here, we want to think about as if we're looking from below. And this is because in the standard MRI, if this were an MRI picture, what's on our left is the right side, and what's on our right is the left side. And that's a little bit confusing. And the best way that I can think of to conceptualize it is picture that when you're looking at this picture, or in an MRI as you're running through it, that you are standing by the patient's feet. They're lying down in front of you. You're closest to their feet and looking up towards their head. And of course, if that was the case, then it makes sense that this would be their right side and this would be their left side. So we'll just remind ourselves that when let's say we're thinking about the right eye here, and light is coming from the patient's left side. It enters the eye and stimulates now the temporal aspects of the retina. These are labeled as the red fibers here. These retinal nerve fiber layer is stimulated, and that stimulates a neuron that runs from the retinal nerve fiber layer all the way back through the optic nerve to the chiasm. That same neuron, or its axon, moves back. Sorry, I just lost my cursor here for a second. All the way through what's called the optic tract to the lateral geniculate body, which is a part of the thalamus that's dedicated to vision. There it synapses onto a new neuron. That second neuron now runs back to the occipital cortex through what are called the optic radiations. And we know that the same sort of thing would happen here on the nasal aspect. So light coming now from the patient's right side would stimulate the opposite retina. Nasal fiber gets stimulated, and it travels back alongside the temporal fiber. But here when we come to the chiasm, there's this crossing. This fiber here moves over from the right side of the body to the left side of the body. And that occurs at the chiasm, of course. And the fiber travels backward, once again synapsing in the lateral geniculate body, and then moving back to the occipital cortex through the optic radiations. And the optic tract is the anatomical localization between the chiasm and the lateral geniculate nucleus. So this part of our pathway is known as the optic tract. Okay, so let's move on. So here's a visual field, and I hope that perhaps you recognize that this is a normal visual field. And in the case of looking at our visual field by convention, and again we're kind of stuck with conventions here that sometimes make it a little more confusing, this side is now the left eye. So unfortunately, when we're thinking about an MRI slice, what we have on our left was the right eye. But when we're thinking about the visual field, what we have on the left is the left eye, and what we have on the right is the right eye. The reason is that whoever developed it chose to present the visual fields through the patient's perspective. So this, if you were the patient, is what you would be seeing. And what I like to think about it, at least in these 24-2 fields, is you can think that this is where the nose would be. and that's why it has this shape. Of course, that's not really why it's like that, but it just helps to remind ourselves that. And the question is, what are these dark areas over here and here? You can pause for a second and think about it, but the answer is that that's the physiologic blind spot. And I'm just going to take a second to remind you what we mean by the physiologic blind spot. So the idea is that light comes in and is stimulating all these photoreceptors at the back surface of the eye. Except what happens when a light ray comes in and falls right on the optic nerve itself? Well, there's no photoreceptors there. So that area in the visual field whose light rays happen to be falling on the optic nerve will not be visualized. And that correlates with this physiologic blind spot. That tells us exactly that's where the location of the optic nerve would be in an anatomical correlation to the visual field. So here we have a little diagram that we just want to remind ourselves that if we're looking at a person, that the image from that person through the light rays becomes inverted at the back of the eye. And we're just going to do a little demonstration now that helps us think a little bit about the physiologic blind spot and applies it to a certain pathological situation. So let's take a silly example here. We have a person and they are on a safari somewhere in Africa and they're walking around with their left eye closed. They're looking with their right eye at everything. And here's what they're looking at. And although there's something that we clearly see as interesting here, we'll forget about that for now. The person is focusing on something going on over here. Here would be a representation of the person's visual field with their right eye. This again would be where their nose is, and this is where we would say their blind spot is. This is the correlating visual field that they would be experiencing. And here's how it would fall out on the retina. So we have our optic nerve here, and we have the corresponding localization. Again, as we know, the actual visual field a person has is much larger than this, but this is what's being measured, at least on a Humphrey visual field 24-2. Okay, so let's say that the person's focusing on something in the location of this number 1 spot. They think that they see an interesting bird or bug there, so they're looking there. So where will those light rays fall? They'll enter the eye and fall on the fovea. And where does that correspond to on our visual field? That corresponds to the center. Let's take another spot over here in the picture. Let's say that there's what's going on over here. Where's that stimulating the retina? So again, because of this idea of the inverted image, that's going to stimulate a spot, even though the source, the image, is below the center. Because of everything becomes inverted, it stimulates a spot on the retina that's above the fovea. But where's the corresponding point on the visual field? It will be once again below. So we see here how our visual field is correlating with the patient's perspective, what they're seeing as they look through their right eye. And of course, if you haven't already guessed it, where is the lion sitting? Where are the light rays from the lion going? They happen to be falling right on the patient's optic nerve, and that corresponds to the blind spot. And that's why it would be never recommended to walk around on a safari closing one of your eyes. So hopefully this is just a silly illustration of how the blind spot works in terms of visual fields. But it does have a clinical significance. What we see here in this picture, and we'll deal with this in a different lecture, is a swollen optic nerve. And you can actually in some ways appreciate the fact that it's swollen because here we see folds of retina. So the optic nerve, we would say, is expanded so much that it's actually pushing the retina to the side, forming creases in it. And what would you expect then to happen in terms of the blind spot? So we would expect that the blind spot enlarges, and that's in fact what we see. Now, for those who are more informed about what's going on here, there's debate about whether that's really the mechanism of the blind spot, and it might have to do with other optical issues, but this is at least just a good way of conceptualizing what's going on. So let's come back to our diagram over here, where we have the pathways that we established. And let's pretend now that there's, in this case, a mass that's pushing right here on the optic pathways. So what do we expect in terms of the visual field? So here's a multiple choice situation. Can you pick which visual field would make most sense to go along with this mass that I've presented? So you can take a second and pause the video and look at it, and I'll give the answer in a second. So we know again that because we're looking at this as if it was an MRI, that this is the right side, this is the right eye, and therefore in terms of our visual fields, we said that these are the left eyes. So certainly this answer would not be appropriate because that's not where the mass is compressing. So that means it's either going to be this visual field or this visual field, the top or the bottom one. That's the correct answer. In the top visual field, what's being lost is the vision on the nasal side of the visual field, whereas in the bottom visual field, what's being lost is the vision on the temporal aspect. So let's think about what's going on here and what we would expect to happen. Well, the mass itself is compressing the temporal fibers that are coming from the retina, and the temporal fibers are responsible for picking up the vision that's coming in from the nasal side. From, in this case, since it's the right eye, from the left side. So let's come back now to our visual fields, and what would be the right answer? So it would be the top one, where the visual field defect is in the right eye on the nasal side, the left side of the right eye visual field. What if we had a lesion that was at the chiasm itself, right over here? Which of the following visual fields would be the likely results? So let's think about, you can pause for a second and give your answer. So the middle visual field certainly does not make sense because only one eye is being affected, and we know that obviously because we have fibers from both eyes involved, the visual field defect should occur in both eyes. So do the defects occur on the nasal aspects of both eyes or on the temporal aspects? Well, here we have the nasal fibers that are being affected, but don't let that fool you into thinking that it's the nasal visual field that's affected, because obviously, again, everything's reversed. The fibers that are on the nasal aspects of each optic nerve take vision from the temporal fields, and so our correct answer is the bottom one, and this is the well-known bitemporal hemianopsia. I've shown a dramatic example where the whole temporal visual field is affected, but in most cases that's not what happens, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, where only part of the temporal visual field is lost. Okay, so let's say that we now have a lesion over here. What is the corresponding visual field that we're looking for? So in terms of the answer, the lesion is sitting on the right optic tract, and that is going to interfere with the visual field in both eyes that's coming from the left side, the contralateral side. So this visual field is obviously not appropriate because it's deficits on the right side. This is on the right, but this is on the left side. That's also would be wrong. And so we're left with the bottom visual field, where the affected area is where it should be on the patient's left through their view. How about here? Which of the visual fields is the correct one? So we have a lesion that's sitting at the right optic radiations. And once again, we would say the same idea, that it's going to affect what's on the patient's left from both eyes. So obviously the top choice is not correct. Now we're left with these two choices here. This one's similar to one that we saw before. So we would think that if it applied here on the optic tracts, perhaps it should apply here. But the idea is that the bottom one is the correct choice, or the more correct choice. And this is the idea that as we move further and further back, well, these fibers, the temporal fibers from the right eye and the nasal fibers from the left eye, well, they're really carrying vision about the same area of the visual field, what's on the patient's left. As we move further and further back, the fibers corresponding to a specific retinal location from both eyes come closer together in space progressively, so that as the lesion occurs further back, the visual field becomes very symmetric. The deficit becomes very symmetric. That the same fibers that are affected in, let's say, the left eye, are coming from the left eye, correspond to the same locations in the right eye. And this is a very typical lesion that would be seen for optic radiations. All right. So how about this visual field defect? Where would that localize to? So let's think it through. Of course, we have a defect that's on the left of both eyes, and that should put it in what we would call the retrochiasmal pathways on the right side of the brain. But is it optic tract? Is it optic radiation? Well, as you may be guessing, it's going to be the occipital cortex. And there's an added layer of explanation that we need to provide here. As you can see, what's being affected not only is the left side, but it's the left upper side of each zone. And as we remember, everything's inverted. So the fibers that would be affected in the retina in this case would be the lower fibers of the retina. Or this is the signal coming from the lower fibers. And the signal coming from the lower fibers would translate into a particular location in the brain. And while what's on the left crosses over to the right and what's on the right crosses over to the left, the fibers that are on the bottom stay on the bottom. The fibers, if you took a section through the optic nerve here, the fibers that are on the most inferior aspect of the optic nerve correspond to the inferior retina. And even if you go all the way back here in the optic radiations, it's still the same case that the fibers that are most inferior correspond to the inferior retina, which again corresponds to the top part of the visual field. And so what we're dealing with here would be a lesion in the occipital cortex, but inferiorly. And what's important to point out is the way that it respects this midline here. So how is that? So we have to learn a little bit, or refresh our memory a little bit about the anatomy of the occipital cortex. So here in this animation, we see now where the occipital cortex is. The occipital cortex really is on the inner aspect of each hemisphere at the back part. And this red line that we see here corresponds to the sulcus called the calcarine sulcus that really divides the occipital cortex into an inferior part and a superior part. And in our case, the visual field defect, which was an upper visual field defect, corresponds to the inferior aspect of the occipital cortex below the calcarine sulcus. So this would be where our lesion would be expected to be, in the right side of the brain, but in the inferior aspect of the occipital cortex below the calcarine sulcus. So we come back to the visual field that we started the presentation off with, and I hope by now you're able to look at that and predict that this is a bitemporal hemianopsia. And you'll notice, of course, that in the right eye visual field that it's the temporal aspect that has been lost, and in the left eye visual field it's the temporal aspect that has been lost, and that implicates the nasal crossing fibers that would be located at the chiasm. One feature that you also might notice that I alluded to before is the fact that it's primarily the top part of each visual field that's been affected. The inferior aspect has been relatively spared. Why would that be? So take a second to think about it, and we'll move on now to the answer. The answer would be, first of all, thinking about the fact that if the superior visual field is affected, then that would mean that the fibers at the chiasm that are being compressed are the inferior fibers, because the inferior fibers are the ones coming from the inferior retina of each eye. So something's going on that's pushing on the inferior fibers of the chiasm and not pushing on the superior fibers. So where does that suggest that the lesion is? It suggests that the lesion is below the chiasm. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. Because here in our cross-section, our sagittal cross-section, we have an optic nerve coming to the chiasm here. And what do we find right below the chiasm? The pituitary gland. And what's probably the most common, classic reason for having a chiasmopathy? It's a pituitary adenoma, where the pituitary enlarges and pushes on the bottom part of the chiasm first. And this explains why we have the defect that we do, where it's the superior parts of each temporal zone that have been affected. Okay, that's the end of this section of the talk.